"You violated the lease terms." Gerald Thompson's voice was cold, his stance firm, as he shoved the eviction notice into Barack Obama's hands. Obama's brows furrowed as he scanned the document. There must be some mistake, but Thompson's smirk said otherwise. This wasn't about rent, it was about race. Whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some watched in silent complicity, while others stepped forward, outraged. The air was thick with tension. Would Obama fight back, or was Thompson about to learn a lesson he'd never forget? Have you ever seen someone unfairly targeted? Did you speak up? Comment where you're watching from, like, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The neighborhood Barack Obama now called home was a far cry from the grandeur of the White House. Nestled on the outskirts of a bustling city, it was filled with modest homes, each with its own story of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance. The streets were lined with old oak trees whose leaves whispered in the wind. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's name, but no one really knew each other's struggles. Here, the grind of daily life was palpable, and though there was warmth, there was also a quiet undercurrent of prejudice. The community, for all its charm, was a microcosm of the broader world, where status often meant little when it came to facing discrimination. Obama had hoped this would be his retreat, a place to regain peace, but little did he know that the calm would soon be shattered by forces beyond his control. Barack Obama, once the most powerful man in the world, now walked through the streets of his new neighborhood as just another person. He had traded the spotlight for privacy, the heavy demands of the presidency for the simple pleasures of daily life. Despite his global success, Obama sought only peace and quiet, moments to reflect, to read, to be with family. His past achievements were still fresh in the minds of many, but Obama never flaunted them. Instead, he wore the humility of someone who had faced both triumphs and failures. He was now navigating the world like anyone else, far from the comforts of power, yet burdened by the same struggles many ordinary people faced. The transition wasn't easy. The weight of public expectations, of personal loss, and of a country divided hung heavily on him. Yet Obama remained hopeful, believing that despite his battles, there was still room for personal growth and quiet transformation. He had a new mission: to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Little did he know that mission would soon collide with an ugly reality. Gerald Thompson, the landlord, seemed like a man of good character at first. With a neat appearance and a pleasant smile, he carried himself with an air of professionalism, making him come across as respectable. He was always polite, nodding as Obama greeted him or discussing small matters regarding the building. But his politeness quickly wore thin when it came to Obama. There was an edge to his tone, a faint coldness in his voice whenever he spoke directly to Obama. For instance, Thompson often questioned Obama's choice of payment methods, subtly implying that a man of his stature should be handling finances differently. His eyes lingered just a bit too long when looking at Obama, examining his clothes, his demeanor, his presence. Each encounter was marked by these subtle jabs. Questions about Obama's rent payments were posed with an undercurrent of doubt, as though Obama's character was always in question. Thompson would ask, "Are you sure this payment is legitimate?" with a raised eyebrow, though he never directed the same suspicion at other tenants. Obama felt the weight of Thompson's judgment, a silent form of discrimination that could not be ignored, though it was never spoken out loud. Every encounter left Obama wondering how to address what was so clearly there, yet so cleverly hidden. In the midst of this growing tension, Obama wasn't left without allies. Sarah, a longtime tenant who lived in the building, had observed Thompson's behavior over the years and quickly recognized the undercurrent of racism directed at Obama. Sarah had lived in the neighborhood long enough to understand how things worked and how things didn't work. She had watched as Thompson treated other tenants with respect, And she had seen the way he treated Obama, almost as if Obama were a problem that needed fixing. Sarah, though quiet by nature, was a woman of principle, and she couldn't turn a blind eye. One afternoon, she approached Obama in the hallway, her voice low but steady. "I see what he's doing," she said, her tone filled with both sympathy and frustration. "You don't have to take it. I've seen landlords like him before, always playing the same game." For the first time since the eviction notice, Obama felt a sense of solidarity. Sarah wasn't just an ally. She was a voice of clarity in a moment where everything seemed uncertain. Yet not everyone in the neighborhood was so willing to take a stand. Officer Marcus, the local cop who had frequented the building on various calls over the years, found himself at a crossroads. He had known Thompson for years, and their families shared connections that ran deep. Marcus was a man of duty, but duty and friendship weren't always aligned. He found himself torn between his loyalty to Thompson and his sense of justice. There were moments when he wanted to speak out, when he saw the way Thompson was treating Obama. But Marcus was hesitant, afraid of the consequences, unsure of how to confront someone he had known for so long. His indecision hung in the air like a cloud, and he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he had to choose a side, yet he wasn't sure which side would truly be the right one. The pressure weighed heavily on him, adding a layer of complexity to the situation that Obama couldn't ignore. Do you think people in positions of power can treat others unfairly even without realizing it? How have you seen this play out in your own life or the lives of others? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. As the days passed, small incidents began to build the tension between Obama and Gerald Thompson. At first, they were subtle, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, but Obama noticed. He would drop his rent check off on the first of every month, as he had always done, but Thompson would make a point of questioning its legitimacy every time. "Are you sure you want to pay by check?" Thompson would ask, his voice carrying a hint of doubt. "We could do something faster, maybe wire transfer. Or are you sure you don't want to go with something more immediate?" The suggestion was always the same. Obama's rent payments weren't good enough, despite the fact that every check was always cleared and timely. But Thompson's insinuations were loud enough to be heard in the halls, leaving Obama feeling humiliated every time. Then there were the comments that seemed more innocent at first glance, but Obama couldn't ignore them. Thompson would often ask about Obama's origins, a question that felt more invasive than friendly. "You've been in this neighborhood a long time now, huh? Must feel strange for someone from, well, your background." He would trail off as if expecting Obama to explain himself, to apologize for his mere presence. It was these small remarks that wore on Obama's nerves, chipping away at the quiet peace he had hoped for in this new chapter of his life. Obama had spent years facing racism in different forms, from the subtle to the overt, but never had he expected to be subjected to this in his own home. Each time Thompson cast a veiled insult or insinuated that Obama was somehow other, it was a reminder of how deep the roots of prejudice ran. What had once seemed like an idyllic place to heal and rest now felt more like a battleground. How could someone of his stature be treated like this when he was just trying to live a simple life? The weight of the situation began to take a toll on Barack Obama. He had spent years in the spotlight, his every action scrutinized, his words dissected. Now, in this quiet corner of the world, he hoped for peace, a chance to live without constant attention. Yet in the face of subtle yet undeniable discrimination, peace seemed increasingly out of reach. The landlord's veiled comments, the questioning of his payments, the way Thompson treated him like an outsider, it was all wearing him down. Obama found himself torn between two forces, the desire for calm, to retreat back into a quiet life, and the urge to stand up to confront this injustice head-on. The latter seemed so far removed from the life he had hoped to live in this neighborhood. Should he escalate things? Should he take action and make it known that he wouldn't stand for such treatment? Or should he continue to keep his head down, focusing on personal healing, trying to avoid stirring up a storm? As days passed, Obama's frustration grew. He couldn't escape the growing sense of powerlessness. In the back of his mind, he wondered, was this how people like him were always treated when they tried to slip out of the public eye, when they tried to live just like anyone else? The thought was maddening. He had been the most powerful person in the world, yet here he was, feeling helpless against an unjust system that seemed designed to keep him in his place. The emotional toll was real. There were nights when he lay awake, the ceiling above him feeling heavier than ever, wondering if he was meant to just let it go. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. This wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. As the weeks passed, the emotional weight of the situation grew heavier on Obama. The discrimination he faced wasn't just a series of small slights, it was beginning to seep into every part of his life. Despite his past, despite the respect he had earned as a leader, he found himself being reduced to something less than that, a target of petty biases and systemic indifference. He had hoped that by addressing the issue through legal means, things would resolve themselves. He contacted a lawyer, believing that justice would be swift, but soon realized how wrong he was. The legal process proved far more difficult than he could have anticipated. Each phone call to his lawyer was met with vague responses, delays, and repeated roadblocks. The legal channels that should have helped him navigate the discrimination only seemed to lead to more frustration. The landlord's lawyers were quick to dismiss his claims, citing the technicalities of the lease agreement, and Obama felt the cold grip of bureaucracy squeezing tighter. It was clear now, this wasn't just about one landlord's actions, it was a symptom of something much larger, a system that often turned a blind eye to injustices when those in power were involved. Even when Obama tried to seek support from the local authorities, he found that those he hoped would help remained distant. Officer Marcus, who had always seemed conflicted but willing to offer guidance, now seemed cold and distant. It wasn't that Marcus was openly hostile, but his indifference spoke volumes. He avoided the issue, deflecting Obama's inquiries with vague reassurances. "I'll look into it," he would say, but there was no follow-up, no sense of urgency. Obama couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus, torn between his professional duty and personal connections, was silently siding with Thompson. The silence from others in the community was just as deafening. In the beginning, Sarah had been a steady ally, offering moral support and advice. But as time passed, even she began to feel the strain. The pressure of speaking out against a landlord with deep roots in the community weighed on her, and there were moments when Obama could see the hesitation in her eyes. The whispers in the hallway grew louder, and some of the other tenants, who had once seemed friendly, began to avoid him. Those who had quietly supported Obama from the beginning now kept their distance. Some even seemed to side with Thompson, repeating his justifications in hushed tones, echoing the landlord's words. It was clear now that in this tight-knit community, standing up for Obama meant putting a target on your own back. Obama had always believed that unity and solidarity could overcome any barrier, that the truth would speak for itself. But now, with each passing day, he felt the full weight of isolation. The distance from his neighbors, the indifference from the legal system, and the refusal to address the deeper issues all contributed to a suffocating sense of loneliness. He was fighting not only a landlord, but an entire system of silent complicity. Even when he reached out, even when he tried to hold on to hope, the response was always the same: indifference, isolation, and an overwhelming sense that he was fighting a battle no one else was willing to join. It was an exhausting cycle. Each attempt to stand up for his rights seemed to only push him further away from the very people who should have been his allies. The battle felt endless, and Obama found himself questioning whether anyone would ever truly understand what he was going through, or if his fight would ever make a difference. Despite the mounting challenges, Sarah remained a steadfast ally, refusing to let Obama fight this battle alone. She saw the injustice clearly, and her determination to stand by him never wavered. Over time, she began rallying the other tenants, encouraging them to speak out and share their own experiences. With Thompson's discriminatory behavior, she approached them one by one, speaking quietly in hallways, in the small courtyard, and even outside the local grocery store. "This isn't just about him, you know," Sarah would say. "It's about all of us, the way he treats everyone. If we don't speak up now, nothing will change." At first, a few tenants expressed their support, nodding in agreement. But as soon as the conversation shifted toward taking action, the hesitation grew. "I don't want to get involved," one tenant said. "Thompson's been around for years. He knows everyone here." Another added, "I can't risk upsetting the status quo. What if things get worse for me?" Sarah's frustration deepened as the residents who had once seemed like friends withdrew further into the shadows, afraid of speaking out. The same cold indifference was evident when she turned to Officer Marcus. Sarah had hoped that given his position, he might have been an ally. But when she approached him in the lobby one evening, she saw the hesitation in his eyes. "I'm not sure it's as clear-cut as you think," he said, his tone uncertain. "Thompson's been around for a long time. He's got connections. You know how it works." The words stung. Sarah had known Marcus to be a man of integrity, but now, faced with the weight of the situation, he seemed to shrink back. Obama, watching from a distance, felt the tension grow heavier. He had hoped that the community would stand together against Thompson, that the power of many voices would drown out the prejudice of one. But as Sarah fought on, urging others to stand with him, Obama couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't just about winning against Thompson. It was about the fear that ran so deep in the community. Fear of retaliation. Fear of the unknown. Fear of standing up against power even when it was unjust. The silence was deafening, and Obama's isolation grew. Despite Sarah's efforts, it seemed that the fight he had hoped would bring people together was instead driving them further apart. As the days wore on, Thompson's behavior grew more overt, more aggressive. What had once been subtle insinuations and passive-aggressive comments soon turned into open hostility. He no longer masked his disdain. He made it clear that Obama was a problem in his eyes, someone who did not belong in his building. One afternoon, Obama returned home to find another notice slipped under his door. This time, it wasn't just a question about overdue rent. It was an official eviction notice. The words on the paper were sharp and final, demanding that Obama vacate the premises in 30 days. No excuses, no negotiations, just an uncompromising demand to leave. The notice felt like a punch to the gut. He'd seen it coming for weeks, but to see it written down, to have Thompson take that final step, made the reality sink in with brutal clarity. Thompson wasted no time in pushing Obama to the brink. As Obama stood in the hallway, holding the eviction notice, Thompson appeared from around the corner, a smug grin on his face. "You should have known better, Mr. Obama," he sneered. "Not everyone gets special treatment, no matter how many people they've fooled. I've given you enough chances, and now it's time for you to face the consequences of your own actions." The words were laced with contempt. There was no mistaking the venom in Thompson's tone now. Obama's mind raced, the reality of his situation coming into sharp focus. This wasn't about rent or paperwork. It was about something much deeper. Thompson wasn't just evicting him as a tenant. He was targeting him for who he was. As the landlord turned to walk away, Obama felt a surge of anger rise within him. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a passive victim of the situation. He felt empowered, and the realization hit him. He could no longer remain silent. This was more than a battle for a roof over his head. It was a fight for his dignity, his rights, and for the principles that had guided him through years of public service. "I'm not leaving," Obama called out, his voice steady but firm. Thompson stopped and looked back, his smirk faltering for a moment. "You've made a mistake," Obama continued, taking a step forward, "and I'm not going to stand by and let you get away with this. Not without a fight." The words hung in the air. Obama was no longer just a former president trying to live a quiet life. He had transformed into something else in that moment, a man ready to confront the unfairness that had been slowly eating away at him. Thompson's expression hardened, and he sneered in response. "You really think you can win this? You're just another tenant. I've got the power here, Obama. Don't forget your place." His words dripped with condescension, but Obama wasn't deterred. "I'm not going anywhere," Obama repeated, this time with more conviction. He had made up his mind. This wasn't about him versus Thompson anymore. It was about standing up against the discrimination that Thompson represented. It was about the larger fight, the one that millions of others faced every day. The moment hung between them, charged with the tension of two opposing forces, finally clashing head-on. Obama's heart pounded in his chest, but the adrenaline was no longer fear. It was the fight for justice awakening inside him. As Thompson turned and stalked off, Obama's resolve only hardened. He knew that this fight wasn't going to be easy. He knew it would be long and hard, and it would test him in ways he had never imagined. But in that moment, one thing was clear. He would not back down. The stage was set for a confrontation, one that would not only change Obama's life, but perhaps the life of everyone in the neighborhood who had remained silent. What would you do if you were in Obama's shoes, fighting against an unfair situation? Would you stand up, or would you stay silent? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how you would handle this challenge. The day of the confrontation arrived with a sharpness that cut through Obama's thoughts. He had spent countless hours trying to find the right moment, the right words, and now there was no more waiting, no more turning the other cheek, no more letting Thompson's blatant disrespect slide. Obama knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. This was about standing up against something much bigger, something that had been festering for too long. Obama walked to Thompson's office with a determination he hadn't felt in years. His heart raced, but it was no longer the anxiety he had felt in the early days of this fight. Now, it was the rush of knowing that this was his moment, his stand for dignity, for justice. As he entered the office, Thompson looked up from his desk with an arrogant smile, but the smile faded when he saw the fire in Obama's eyes. "You don't get to treat me like this," Obama began, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get to hide behind your power, your position, your so-called rules to push me around." Thompson opened his mouth to interrupt, but Obama raised his hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No, you're going to listen." The words came tumbling out now, a mixture of frustration, resolve, and righteous anger. "You think you can degrade me, humiliate me, just because I'm different? You think I'm just some tenant you can manipulate, humiliate, and throw away?" Obama's voice gained strength, and Thompson's confidence began to crack. "You've made it clear that you don't respect me. You don't respect anyone who's not like you, but I'm not here to let you push me around anymore. I'm here to make sure you understand that what you're doing is wrong, that it's not just about me, it's about the hundreds, the thousands of people you've hurt over the years. You've treated people like me as less than you, and that stops now." Thompson's face tightened, his initial smugness replaced by the discomfort of being confronted with his own prejudice. Obama stood tall in the face of it, refusing to back down. The room was thick with the tension of the moment. Thompson finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. "You think I've got something to prove to you? I don't care who you are. This is my building, and I run things the way I see fit." Obama's expression hardened. "You care more about power than people, Thompson, and that's the problem. You're so caught up in your need to control, in your prejudice, that you can't see how wrong you've been. This isn't just about rent or rules. It's about respect. It's about human decency. It's about treating people like people, not like something beneath you." For a moment there was silence, as the weight of Obama's words hung in the air. Thompson shifted in his seat, clearly rattled but trying to regain his composure. Obama could see it in his eyes. The landlord was no longer sure of himself. He had expected submission, fear, maybe even compliance. What he had gotten instead was a man who refused to be bullied anymore. Obama leaned forward, his voice now firm but filled with an unshakable calm. "I will not leave this building, and I will fight you every step of the way. You will be held accountable for this, not just by me, but by every single person you've hurt along the way. I won't let you get away with it." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost tangible, as if a moment had passed in time. Obama stood there, his posture straight and unyielding, his eyes locked on Thompson. In that moment, the power dynamics had shifted. Obama wasn't just a former president anymore. He was a man, standing up for what was right. Thompson didn't know how to respond. The anger, the malice, the dismissive attitude had drained from him. He was left speechless. A man who had been stripped of his veneer of control. Obama had called him out for what he truly was, a man whose authority had been built on arrogance, fear, and prejudice. And as Obama turned to leave, the tension still thick in the air, he knew that this was the turning point. There was no going back now. He had taken the first step in fighting, not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been silenced by the systems of power that sought to keep them in place. After the confrontation with Thompson, something inside Obama shifted. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a flicker of hope. Hope that perhaps this fight wasn't one he had to fight alone. It was in the days following the intense meeting that Sarah, Officer Marcus, and a handful of other tenants began to find their voices, rallying around Obama in an unexpected show of unity. Sarah was the first to approach him after the confrontation. She knew the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just one man standing up to his landlord. It was a turning point for the entire building, for the community. She had heard Thompson's cruel words, and she had seen Obama's resolve. "I'm with you," she said quietly, standing beside him in the hallway. "You don't have to do this alone. We're going to make sure you don't have to fight him by yourself." And just like that, Sarah became more than just an ally. She became a leader. She began reaching out to other tenants, urging them to come forward with their own stories of Thompson's mistreatment. The first few were hesitant, nervous about speaking out against someone with so much power over their lives. But Sarah's steady encouragement, combined with Obama's undeniable strength, inspired them to open up. Slowly but surely, the voices that had once been silent started to rise. Officer Marcus, who had been torn between his professional duties and his personal relationships, also took action. He had watched from the sidelines for too long, unsure of how to involve himself, but now he saw the injustice clearly. No longer could he remain neutral. One afternoon, he approached Obama as he was leaving the building. "I've seen enough," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I'm on your side. I'll make sure Thompson can't get away with this." The commitment in Marcus's voice was a powerful moment for Obama. Marcus, as an officer of the law, held a certain level of authority that could turn the tide. His decision to stand with Obama sent ripples through the building. If Officer Marcus, someone many tenants respected and looked up to, was willing to risk his position to help, maybe others would follow suit. Word spread quickly. The tenants who had once been afraid to speak up now found the courage to stand together. People who had previously sided with Thompson out of fear began to change their minds. They saw Obama's unwavering strength and began to question Thompson's authority. It was no longer just Obama's battle, it was theirs too. They recognized the injustice of Thompson's behavior and, more importantly, the moral imperative. To challenge it, the power of unity became undeniable. What had started as Obama's personal struggle grew into a collective movement. Tenants who had once stayed silent, afraid to lose their homes or their status in the building, now started to join the effort. They gathered in small groups, writing down their stories, supporting each other through the fear of retaliation. They began to see Thompson for who he really was, a man whose power had been built on fear and prejudice, but whose authority was crumbling beneath the weight of truth and solidarity. Even those who had once been indifferent or wary now found themselves on the side of justice. The entire building began to shift. The tenants' voices grew louder, their courage infectious. No longer were they content to live in the shadows of Thompson's oppressive rule. They realized that standing together was the only way to dismantle the system of power Thompson had created. And as the days went by, it became clear that Thompson's grip on the building was slipping. The support for Obama and the others continued to build, and the community's recognition of the injustice they had long overlooked began to spread. Obama, once isolated in his fight, now stood at the center of a movement, surrounded by the strength of his community. The battle was far from over, but as Obama stood side by side with his allies, he knew one thing for certain. Together, they were stronger than Thompson's prejudice. Together, they would make sure that the injustice he had faced would not go unchallenged. The turning point in Obama's fight came when his legal team, after weeks of hard work, uncovered the evidence that would unravel Thompson's carefully constructed facade of respectability. Obama had known deep down that the issue was larger than just one eviction. It wasn't simply about him as a tenant, it was about the systemic racism that Thompson represented. Still, Obama had no concrete proof, no way of showing the depth of Thompson's prejudice. That was until his legal team began digging deeper. After poring over old records, talking to past tenants, and analyzing Thompson's history as a landlord, they found undeniable patterns of discrimination. Obama's lawyer, Alice Brooks, was the first to make the connection. She had been in the business long enough to know that evictions like Obama's weren't a rare occurrence. "This isn't just about you, Barack," Alice said one afternoon, her voice low but urgent. "Thompson has been doing this for years, and not just to you. He's done it to other tenants too." The discovery was shocking. Thompson had, over the course of his tenure as landlord, evicted several tenants for vague or baseless reasons. Some were in similar positions to Obama, successful professional individuals, but Thompson had cast them aside for reasons that seemed to be tied not to their behavior, but to their race. Each eviction followed a predictable pattern: vague accusations about lease violations, exaggerated claims about late payments, and an underlying discriminatory attitude that painted people of color as problems to be eliminated. Alice and her team worked tirelessly to gather more evidence. They spoke to former tenants, some who had already left the building, and others who had been too afraid to speak up before. The stories they uncovered were damning. One former tenant, a black woman named Rachel, revealed how Thompson had made repeated comments about her being too difficult and distrusting authority when she questioned discrepancies in her rent payments. Another tenant, a Hispanic man named Carlos, shared how Thompson had suddenly raised his rent without notice, then proceeded to evict him when he couldn't meet the new terms. Each story mirrored Obama's experience, and each one added another layer of proof that Thompson's actions weren't just biased, they were systematic. As the evidence mounted, it became clear. Thompson had been running a business built on a foundation of racial discrimination. The records, the tenant testimonies, and the consistent pattern of unfair treatment were irrefutable. Obama's legal team now had what they needed to expose Thompson's prejudice in court, and it was clear that the truth was about to turn the tide in Obama's favor. Obama sat in his lawyer's office, the weight of the situation sinking in. As Alice laid out the evidence before him, the thick stack of documents told the story he had always known but couldn't prove. "We have him," Alice said with a smile of quiet satisfaction. "This is a clear case of racial discrimination, and now we can prove it." The thought of exposing Thompson, of revealing the truth to the community, filled Obama with a sense of vindication, but also a new sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every tenant who had been wronged by Thompson's discriminatory actions. This was about the broader fight against prejudice and systemic racism, a fight that had begun long before Obama moved into this building, and one that would continue long after this case was over. The moment felt like a turning point in the battle, but Obama knew that the real fight was only just beginning. With the evidence in hand, he now had the power to confront Thompson, not just in a personal sense, but in a public and legal one. The momentary feeling of relief quickly transformed into determination. This was more than a legal victory. It was a chance to bring about real change, to show the community the truth of what had been happening in the shadows for years. The battle against Thompson was far from over, but for the first time, Obama could see a clear path forward. The truth, no matter how hard it might be to face, was now on his side, and with it, he knew that justice was within reach. As the case began to gain traction, the energy in the building shifted. What had once been a quiet struggle, confined to the confines of one apartment, soon erupted into a public spectacle. The community, which had stood largely indifferent, was now forced to reckon with the ugly truth. News of the lawsuit against Thompson spread like wildfire, reaching beyond the walls of the building to local news outlets and social media. The neighborhood, once a microcosm of silence and complacency, was now a battleground where every person had to pick a side. The tension was palpable, and it didn't take long for the divide to become clear. Support for Obama, who had once been a quiet tenant, grew rapidly. People who had been too afraid to speak out before found their voices, joining in solidarity with the fight against Thompson. A group of tenants began holding regular meetings, planning their next moves. They were no longer just victims of a discriminatory system. They were now active participants in a movement for justice. They shared their own stories, stories that mirrored Obama's and highlighted Thompson's long history of abuse. For the first time, Obama felt the power of unity. The community that had once been fractured and fearful was now bound together by a common cause. But not everyone was on board. There were still those who, for reasons of fear, loyalty, or ignorance, stood by Thompson. They defended him as a hard-working businessman, someone who had been part of the neighborhood for years. "He's a good man," they said. "He's just running his business the way anyone else would." It was a refrain that echoed throughout the building and beyond, as those who didn't want to confront the truth tried to justify Thompson's actions. The pressure on Thompson was mounting. Where once his power had been unquestioned, now it was increasingly under scrutiny. Tenants who had once whispered their complaints about him in hushed voices now spoke openly, and Thompson's previously unchallenged authority began to crumble. The very people who had once feared him, now emboldened by the growing support for Obama, started to voice their dissent. It was as if a dam had broken, and there was no turning back. The situation reached A boiling point when a group of local activists organized a peaceful demonstration outside the building. They called for an end to discriminatory practices in housing and supported Obama's case, demanding that Thompson be held accountable for his actions. The protest, though peaceful, was a powerful display of solidarity. People held signs that read, "Justice for Obama" and "End racism in housing." Their voices echoed down the street, and for the first time, Thompson's name was being shouted not with respect, but with contempt. The demonstration, while peaceful, stirred up emotions. Many of the tenants, especially those who had stayed silent or sided with Thompson, began to feel the pressure. Some felt embarrassed that they had stayed passive for so long. Others, fearful of the backlash, tried to distance themselves from the growing movement. The building itself had become a microcosm of the larger societal tension, the fight against systemic racism and the choice to either confront it or stay silent. The local authorities, who had previously shown little interest in the case, began to feel the heat as well. Officer Marcus, whose initial neutrality had been a quiet form of complicity, was now under the public's watch. Social media posts began to circulate, questioning his role and whether he had truly done everything in his power to help Obama. Even members of the police department began to feel the pressure to take a stance. The community's anger, directed not only at Thompson, but at the entire system that allowed people like him to thrive, was palpable. For Obama, the realization was stark. The battle he was fighting wasn't just about his personal rights anymore. It had become a much larger fight for justice. He was no longer a lone man, standing against a single landlord. He had become the face of a larger movement, one that was challenging a system of power, privilege, and prejudice that had long been entrenched in the fabric of society. The public eye was now on him, and the stakes had never been higher. The local media began covering the case more extensively, interviewing tenants who had come forward to support Obama and those who had been silent for years. The narrative was shifting. Obama was no longer just a former president. He was a symbol of the fight for justice, equality, and dignity. His courage in standing up against the system inspired many, but it also made him a target for those who wanted to protect the status quo. The societal tension reached its peak when Thompson, desperate to maintain his power and reputation, attempted to fight back. He began threatening legal action against the tenants and activists involved, claiming that the protest was disrupting his business and slandering his name. His attempts to silence the movement only fueled the fire, making the community rally even harder behind Obama. The fight was no longer confined to a single apartment. It had become a full-blown confrontation between justice and oppression, between those who dared to speak out and those who wanted to maintain the power structures that had kept them safe. As the tension built, Obama knew that this was the moment, the tipping point that could bring about real change, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered in silence for far too long. The eyes of the community and the world were now firmly fixed on Thompson and on the fight for justice that was finally being fought in earnest. When faced with blatant injustice, do you stand up and fight for what's right, or do you stay silent? What factors influence your decision to take action or to hold back? It's not always easy, and sometimes the consequences can be far-reaching. How do you decide what's worth speaking out for? Share your story in the comments, and let's start a conversation about standing up for justice in a world that too often asks us to remain quiet. The day of the court ruling arrived with a sense of heavy anticipation. Obama sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. This was it, the culmination of weeks of tension, struggle, and uncertainty. After months of legal battles, emotional tolls, and the growing pressure from the community, this moment would decide everything. The courtroom was packed, filled with onlookers who had followed the case from the beginning. The media cameras were rolling, their lenses fixed on Obama, who now stood as a symbol not just of personal resilience, but of the fight against systemic racism. The judge, a stern and no-nonsense figure, called the courtroom to order. As Obama sat at the plaintiff's table, he could feel the weight of the moment. Thompson, seated across the room with his own legal team, looked as confident as ever, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was still clinging to the belief that he could control the outcome. After all, he had used his position as landlord to get away with so much for so long. But Obama knew that this time it was different. This time, the truth was on his side. Courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge began to read the verdict. The decision had already been made, but the impact of it would echo far beyond this single case. The judge's voice rang clear as he delivered his ruling. In light of the overwhelming evidence of discriminatory practices, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Barack Obama. The eviction notice is hereby retracted, and Gerald Thompson is ordered to cease all further attempts to unlawfully evict tenants based on race or any other protected characteristic. Mr. Thompson's actions violate both the fair housing laws and the principles of equality that our society upholds. The words hit like a wave, washing over Obama, who had been holding his breath. His eyes closed for a moment as he allowed himself to feel the weight of the victory, both personal and societal. The community sitting in the gallery erupted in applause. It wasn't just Obama's win. It was a win for everyone who had faced similar prejudice, for every tenant who had been taken advantage of, and for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. For Obama, the relief was palpable. The tension he had carried for so long dissolved into tears of joy and disbelief. He turned to Sarah, who had been by his side throughout the entire ordeal. She was smiling, her eyes filled with pride and happiness. "You did it," she said softly, squeezing his hand. Thompson, on the other hand, sat in stunned silence. The smug confidence that had defined him throughout the process vanished, replaced by the grim reality of the legal consequences he now faced. His face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. The evidence had been clear, and the judgment had been swift. His history of discrimination had finally been exposed for all to see. As Obama stood up to leave the courtroom, his legal team surrounding him, the weight of the victory began to sink in. This wasn't just about him being reinstated as a tenant. It was about making a statement. It was about showing the world that racism, no matter how deeply ingrained or how subtle, would no longer be tolerated. And the community that had once stood divided was now united in the knowledge that justice had been served. The sense of triumph was shared by everyone who had supported Obama along the way: Sarah, Officer Marcus, and all of the tenants who had come forward with their own stories of injustice. They had all risked something to stand with Obama, and now they had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up for what was right. For Obama, this victory was a reminder of the power of resilience, the importance of standing firm against injustice, and the strength that comes from knowing you are not alone in the fight for what's right. He had faced down the oppression of one man, but in doing so, he had helped spark a change in a community that had been too afraid to speak out for far too long. As Obama walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by his allies, the applause of the community ringing in his ears, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over. There was still much work to be done, but this was a moment that would define him, a moment that would echo for years to come as a reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, always prevails. As Obama sat in the quiet solitude of his apartment, the echoes of the courtroom victory still rang in his mind. The applause, the victory, the rush of vindication, all of it had been overwhelming in the moment. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he found himself reflecting on something deeper than just the legal triumph. The battle had never truly been about the apartment, the eviction, or even Thompson's discriminatory actions. It had been about something far more profound: his own personal growth, the rediscovery of his own resilience, and the understanding of what it truly meant to stand up for what was right. The weeks of tension had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. At the start, Obama had been hesitant, unsure if confronting this injustice was worth the risk. The emotional toll had been immense, and there were many nights when he had questioned whether it was worth fighting at all. But as time passed, he realized that the fight was not just about him. It was about challenging the systems that allowed injustice to thrive unchecked. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, regardless of the personal cost. It was about confronting the fear, the doubt, and the silence that so often allowed injustice to continue in the shadows. Obama had been through so much in his life, but this experience had opened his eyes to something new. He had spent years in the public eye, constantly fighting battles on a global scale. But this was different. This battle was deeply personal. It wasn't about policy or speeches or even the world's perception of him. It was about standing firm in his truth, about refusing to let a man like Thompson define who he was. He thought about the way he had felt when he first moved into the apartment, the peace he had hoped to find. At the time, Obama had simply wanted to be a man living a quiet life after years of political turbulence. But life, as it always does, had a different plan. The quiet he had sought was replaced by a call to action, one that had demanded more from him than he could have anticipated. But in answering that call, he had found strength within himself that he hadn't known existed. The victory in the courtroom wasn't just the retraction of an eviction notice. It was a lesson in courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what was right. Obama realized that in the end, it was never about the outcome. It was about the process. It was about the people he met along the way, the allies who stepped up when it mattered most. It was about Sarah, who had stood beside him even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was about Officer Marcus, who had found the courage to do what was right. It was about the community that had come together to support him, to stand against the systemic injustice that had plagued them for so long. More than anything, it was about Obama's own transformation. He had entered this fight with uncertainty, but he had emerged with a clearer sense of purpose. The lessons learned in this battle would carry him forward, influencing not just his own future challenges, but the way he approached life itself. He now understood the true cost of complacency, the importance of speaking out, and the transformative power of standing up for others. Obama's growth wasn't just about legal victory or personal vindication. It was about the understanding that justice wasn't a passive endeavor. It wasn't something that just happened. It was something that had to be fought for, something that required courage and perseverance. The fight might not always be easy, and the outcome was never guaranteed, but standing up for what was right was always worth it. As Obama looked out the window, watching the world continue on outside, he felt a new sense of strength. He was no longer just a man who had survived the presidency. He was a man who had faced down fear, who had overcome doubt, and who had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to carry the lessons of this battle forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. This victory had transformed him, not just as a man, but as a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. The ripple effect of the courtroom decision quickly spread beyond the walls of Obama's building. What had once been a quiet legal battle, contained within the boundaries of a single eviction, had now sparked a much larger conversation. The case had forced the community and the city into a reckoning with the deeply embedded issues of discrimination in housing. The court ruling in favor of Obama had not only exposed Thompson's personal prejudice, but had also shone a harsh light on the systemic biases that pervaded the rental market. The local media outlets, which had initially covered the case as just another eviction dispute, now found themselves documenting something much bigger. They reported on the broader implications of the case, highlighting how Thompson's discriminatory practices were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a troubling pattern. The community's reaction was swift. Public discussions on racial inequality in housing, long relegated to whispered conversations, were now in the open, taking center stage in town halls, school meetings, and even local coffee shops. The story was no longer about Obama as a single tenant. He had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up for justice when the system failed to deliver. Sarah, whose unwavering support had been instrumental in this victory, found herself at the forefront of the community's response. She became an unofficial leader, organizing meetings where tenants could discuss their own experiences with discrimination. People who had once remained silent, too afraid to speak out for fear of retribution, now found their voices. Sarah helped to connect them with local advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and even lawyers who specialized in fighting discrimination. What began as an isolated fight against one landlord became a much broader movement, one that sought to address the deep systemic inequities faced by renters of color. Officer Marcus, whose initial hesitation had almost caused him to stay neutral, also found himself changed by the events. He became an outspoken advocate for police accountability and racial justice, publicly denouncing Thompson's actions and speaking out against housing discrimination in the community. His involvement in the case, although initially reluctant, had forced him to confront his own biases and the way his silence had allowed systemic racism to persist unchecked. He now worked alongside other community leaders to create educational programs within the police force, focusing on understanding racial disparities and the role law enforcement could play in fighting discrimination. His change of heart was a testament to the impact one person's courage could have on an entire system. The city council, under growing pressure from the public and local activists, held a series of meetings in which housing policies were re-evaluated. They passed new regulations requiring landlords to undergo training on fair housing practices and racism prevention, making it mandatory for all tenants to be informed of their rights. The conversations that Obama had started in the courtroom were now spilling over into the halls of power. The council's actions were a first step, but many knew this was only the beginning. There was still much to be done, and the journey ahead would not be easy. However, the legal victory had created a foundation, one on which the community could build. It showed that change was possible, that people could no longer be ignored simply because they were marginalized. Obama himself continued to advocate for justice, not just for tenants, but for every individual affected by systemic racism. His presence in the community had made a lasting impact. He used his platform to call for policy changes, speaking at rallies, writing op-eds, and meeting with local leaders to push for further reforms. He knew that while his fight against Thompson had been won, the larger fight was far from over. There were other landlords like Thompson, other communities facing the same struggles, and Obama made it clear that he would not stop until the fight for justice extended beyond just his case. Through these collective actions, the neighborhood, once fractured and hesitant, began to unite. There was a new sense of camaraderie among the tenants, who had once been divided by fear. They began to speak openly about their shared experiences, joining forces to ensure that no one else would have to endure the discrimination that Obama had faced. A community once silenced by fear and prejudice had found its voice, and in doing so, it began to create real change. While the victory in Obama's case was significant, it was just one battle in an ongoing war against systemic racism. But the sense of hope was undeniable. For the first time, people in the community felt like their voices mattered, that the system could be challenged, and that change could come, even when it seemed impossible. Obama, now more than just a former president, had become a catalyst for change. His courage, his resolve, and his refusal to be silenced had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of those around him. As Obama stood at the center of the movement, watching the progress unfold, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight was far from over, but it had already changed lives. And in that moment, he knew that the seeds of systemic change had been planted, and the future, while uncertain, was brighter for those who had found the strength to rise up and speak out. The community had taken its first step toward healing, and Obama knew that no matter how long the journey, the hope for a more just and equal society would continue to grow. As Obama stood in the heart of the community that had once been divided, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The struggle, the battles, the sleepless nights. They had all led to this moment of profound transformation, not just for him, but for the entire community. The victory against Thompson, while monumental, was only a small piece of a much larger ongoing fight for justice. Yet, in that moment, it became clear to Obama that the power to create change had always resided within the people themselves. His personal courage, matched by the collective action of those around him, had shown what was possible when individuals chose to stand up for what was right. This wasn't a story of one man defeating an oppressive figure. This was a story about resilience, the kind of resilience that fuels progress, no matter how difficult the path may seem. Obama had not won because of a simple stroke of luck, but because he had refused to let fear or complacency dictate his life. He had faced injustice head-on, knowing that it wasn't just about his dignity, it was about the dignity of every person who had ever been pushed aside or silenced. His victory was a reminder that no matter how insurmountable the odds may appear, real change is possible. Change happens when people stop waiting for someone else to fight their battles and instead take the reins themselves. It happens when communities come together, when individuals rise above the injustice they face, and when collective action turns quiet frustration into meaningful transformation. The story of Obama's fight against discrimination was more than a legal victory. It was a message of hope, a reminder that standing up for justice, no matter how long it takes, can make a difference. It was a testament to the belief that courage, even in the smallest of acts, can change the course of history. Obama's triumph was a spark, one that ignited a fire of hope in a community once shackled by fear and doubt. Now they stood together, stronger than ever, knowing that the fight for justice was worth every step of the journey. What does true justice look like to you? Do you think this case represents a shift in societal attitudes towards discrimination? How can we all contribute to making justice a reality for everyone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. What did you think of Obama's journey in this story? Do you believe that standing up against injustice can truly create lasting change? Leave your thoughts and reflections in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with your friends to keep the conversation going.